אנו מכריזים בזאת
Yeah, hello, Barry Shaw. This is The View from Israel. Today's guest is a young guy I've known for several years, and I've been very admiring both of his personal history and also the advocacy, the rare advocacy work that he does for Israel, both here and abroad. So, Jonathan Elkhoury, welcome to The View from Israel.
Hi, Barry. Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you, at least on camera. I think because of COVID and other things, the last time we actually met personally was several years ago, I think in Stella Maris, which is a beautiful place in Haifa. Do you remember that meeting?
Oh, yeah, of course. It was in a cafe beside a church in Stella Maris in Haifa.
Yeah. This was a special meeting because I had a friend from England, also not Jewish, Nigel Goodrich, who was a teacher, Christian guy in Scotland, and he personally put together an amalgam of Friends of Israel from different towns and cities in Scotland into the Scottish Friends of Israel. And he was making a visit to Israel, and I met with him. And I told him I wanted him to come up to Haifa because I wanted him to meet some very, let's say, unusual advocates for Israel. And he came up with me to Stella Maris, where we met you, Jonathan. But he also met a young former policewoman who wanted to become an Arab member of the Knesset, believe it or not, for the Likud party. He also met an attractive female teacher and psychologist from a small Arab village of Shibli near Mount Tabor, a biblical mountain. He also met a former Druze mayor of Dalit Carmel, and also a Maronite Christian leader from the north of Israel, Shadi Khalul, who recruits the young men of the northern Galilee into elite IDF fighting units. And I want to tell you, Jonathan, and you viewers, that this collective meeting blew Nigel's mind. And he went back to Israel with a whole host of friends, non-Jewish Israelis, who are perhaps some of the most powerful advocates for Israel because of their unique story. So this is one of the reasons I've invited Jonathan onto the show. Jonathan, your story is pretty unique. Tell me about your background story, starting from your life as a little boy in Lebanon.
Basically, I was born in a small village in south of Lebanon. It's called Marjayun. And my father was a part of the South Lebanon Army, the SLA. This army was established officially in 1982 with the help of Israel, with the agreement of the Lebanese government, and of course, the supervision of the UN and the United States. And what our mission was, and their slogan was for the South Lebanon Army, is the war for peace and for good neighboring. Eventually, what they wanted to achieve was actually to have peace between Israel and Lebanon, and to make sure that the terrorist organization that back then used to be the PLO, controlling the South Lebanon, controlling our villages, harming us, and as well attacking Israel, they wanted to collaborate and make sure that nothing like this happens again, and hopefully to achieve peace between these two countries. Unfortunately, it failed, and in 2000, Israel decided to withdraw from South Lebanon, and Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah terrorist organization, was already in power and took over south of Lebanon, and our lives were in danger, so we had to flee, and Israel opened its borders on the 23rd of May 2000, and welcomed 8,000 Lebanese former South Lebanon Army soldiers, officers, their families. And since then, we are here in Israel. And today we are only 3,500 people, about 680 families. And this is the small community that we have. The majority of us are Christians living in northern of Israel. And this is kind of a really small introduction about my past and how I came to Israel.
Yes, the sad story of Lebanon is that when Israel went in order to try and remove the curse of the Yasser Arafat's Palestinian terrorists, we were hoping that Lebanon would have been able to create a peaceful, prosperous government that would make return Lebanon to be the Monte Carlo of the Middle East as it once was, before it was taken over by Yasser Arafat's Palestinian. But sadly, this didn't happen. And the peacemakers were assassinated in Lebanon. When the vacuum left by the departure of Arafat's Palestinian terrorists was taken up by Hezbollah, which became a proxy of the Iranian regime. And Lebanon has been on a downhill cycle since then. We look forward to the day when Lebanon can regain its proper sovereignty, get rid of Hezbollah, and then become a peaceful, prosperous nation. But at least you and your family managed to get out. A lot of people of the South Lebanon Army were also executed. But since then, you had I believe, a bachelor's degree in political science at Bar-Ilan University. I think also you did studies in Near and Middle East studies at the Tel Aviv University. You served in the IDF, and you were recruited by a group called Reservists on Duty to go on campuses in Europe and the United States. So tell me about that part of your life.
Yeah, so I did national service for 2 years. It's similar to military service. It's just without the uniform. I did it for 2 years in Rambam Facility Hospital in Haifa. It was near my home. And one of the things that I discovered growing up is that eventually we need to be part of the community and the country that we live in. No matter how many objections I have towards what is going on in the country, or things that I want to make better, or things that I want to change. In my opinion, you need to be part of this community. You need to contribute to the society that you live in. So that's why I decided to do national service for 2 years. Eventually, this kind of opened up a whole new world to me, where during my national service, I started advocating for other minorities in Israel that aren't obligated to serve in the military. For example, the Muslims and the Christians and the Bedouins as well are not obligated to serve in the military. They don't receive a mandatory draft, unlike the Druze and unlike the Jewish community as well. So in a way, I started advocating among my friends in my neighborhood. It was a mixed neighborhood in Haifa that were a lot of Arabs and Jews and from different backgrounds, Ethiopian Jews or Russian Jews or those that came from the Soviet Union, Ukrainians, all of them, we were all living together. And we wanted to kind of create this atmosphere where we're all there for each other. So once I started advocating that, I started internally here in Israel before I kind of went and talked about it abroad, because I believed that we needed to encourage our own communities and our own societies to become better and to be more of a crucial part of how Israel is being developed and how Israel is being successful in the world. We can't just sit aside. So after starting doing that from 2012 till about 2016, throughout an organization that was called the Israeli Christian Recruitment Forum, it was known as well as the Christian Empowerment Council. I was the spokesman for that organization as a volunteer for these years, and we advocated for the Christian society here in Israel to do that. And suddenly, a lot of people abroad started to make interest in, wait a minute, what is going on in this small 2% Christian society in Israel that kind of changing minds and hearts of people and actually succeeding in making people who finish high school in the Christian community to join the military or national service. Back at the day, we had about 35 people serving in the military till 2012. And later on, we had about 150. in 1 year. There was a huge change for us, and that made us understand that there's a lot of work to do here. And about 2017, I was approached by Amit Deri, the head of reservists on duty, after speaking in many Knesset committees, kind of in a way begging the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Jewish Agency or any other organizations that were in the Israel advocacy atmosphere, saying to them, you have a group of about 25% of the Israeli population that are not being represented in any of advocacy work around the world. Yes, we do have official representatives in the foreign ministry, but we don't have regular citizens like myself or other people that actually are devoted and want to share their experience as Israeli minorities and refute a lot of the claims and lies that are said about us here. And no one actually listened at that time. They didn't really see the importance of having a minority in the front line against the dehumanizing as well of Israel. And Amit Deri approached me and said, hey, I've heard you speak. I want you to have a platform, and you can build whatever you want. You can have this platform, you can do with it whatever you want. And eventually what we decided to do was to create a minorities group that was built of Muslims, Christians, Druze, and Bedouins that are all Israeli citizens. Some of them didn't serve in the military, some of them didn't serve in national service. But eventually what made us all together is that we're all Israelis and we all wanted to share our experience, our positive experiences as Israeli citizens. And that's what we did. For about 3 years, I've led more than 35 delegations across the States and Europe. Even Nigel, I've met with Nigel before you brought him here to Israel because he created the Shalom Festival. The Shalom Festival, it used to be a festival throughout the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh. And because a few years before that, I think it was around 2015-16, there was a huge BDS protest against a Jewish and Israeli representative in that festival. Nigel decided to create along and beside that Fringe Festival, the Shalom Festival, to kind of call for peace and call for dialogue. And he did an amazing thing. And eventually we went there to help him out, kind of stand in front of the anti-Israeli protesters that were there and start to ignite dialogue and to make sure that we refute a lot of their lies that are telling the people that are just going by there. So you can say that my life has been on this like rail coast of being in front of anti-Israeli activists, of having my events shut down or being protests against me and against the group that we brought, people trying to harm us, even, to take us to there was one event in New York in a synagogue that an anti-Israeli person actually tried to reach one of my speakers on stage and to make him come down. But thank God, and it shouldn't be that way, but thank God the Jewish community in the United States are aware of the situation. So they have a lot of guards in the synagogue to begin with. So they were able to actually make sure that nothing happens to that speaker on stage. But this is what we had to deal with, and this is what we're doing, because eventually we need to do that. We need to have our voices out. We need to have, especially the minorities' voices of Israeli citizens out there, because eventually it's not a typical pro-Israeli voice. It's more of a buildup of a lot of thoughts and actions and a lot of circumstances that you need to take into considerations.
Actually, the Shalom Festival in Edinburgh you spoke about was the initiative of Nigel Goodrich I spoke about earlier, but Nigel has now moved on and he does his Israeli advocacy work from Belgium, where he's now living. Jonathan, if you don't object, don't mind, I'd like to talk to you about your perspective of things from your personal perspective as an Israeli gay guy. I want to know, I'm interested in a few things. First of all, what's your reaction when you represent Israel abroad, especially on campus, and talk about yourself? How does that go down on campus, especially when you meet perhaps the gay community abroad, perhaps those in America, and there are gay organizations who are pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, despite the fact that Hamas has the most deplorable record when it comes to gay people in Gaza. Jonathan, I want to preface that by an unusual coincidence. Simply before coming on air to talk about you, I read an article today which says, better to be a Jew than gay in Gaza. And this was accorded to a young resident, Ahmed, from Gaza City, who had to escape Gaza with his life. And he made his way into Tel Aviv in order to find acceptance and shelter. And he's now living in Canada, where he feels more open to speak about it. So I'd like to know whether, in fact, your experience as an Israeli gay guy, and a Christian Israeli gay guy in Israel, how that goes down if you are confronted or meet some of the people who may be gay and may be anti-Israel abroad.
Yeah, well, I've met with many groups throughout my years in public diplomacy. I've met with anti-Israeli groups. I've met with pro-Israeli groups. I met with people that didn't know what was going on, and they just wanted to have information and to question it, and later on to go on and search for more information. But I did meet with you can say not a few vocal anti-Israeli advocates. And why I'm saying anti-Israeli and not pro-Palestinian, because there's a huge difference between these two definitions. With a pro-Palestinian, first of all, he's pro. So we have a lot in common because we can kind of start a dialogue from somewhere on a lot of things that we agree on. And there are some things that we can agree on. And with an anti-Israeli, the problem is that eventually, no matter what, they don't want to see Israel exist as a Jewish and democratic state. And they don't want to have a dialogue with you. They don't recognize you. They don't want even to question the things that you're saying, or even to question the things that they are saying themselves. And I've met with LGBTQ plus members that were anti-Israelis, that were vocal about it. And one of the major things that I've always, since I mentioned that I'm gay and I speak about it in my lectures as well, once they see me, they always, even though I haven't said anything about the LGBTQ community in Israel, they immediately blame me as a pink washer. And that's a definition that basically is trying in some way to say that Israel is using its gay community or its liberalism or its advanced in pro-LGBTQ community actions to hide what they're doing to the Palestinian community. And in my opinion, I always laugh at it, because on one hand, if we're not advanced in LGBTQ community, they will say that Israel is this dark, unadvanced, shouldn't exist community that is not treating well the LGBTQ community. And if we are advanced in LGBT community, they will say that we're only doing that because we want to hide things that we're doing to the Palestinian Authority. And in my opinion, this is just, it doesn't matter what Israel does, they will always find a way to attack us. So in my opinion, it's something way better, it's something way bigger than that, because eventually these LGBTQ members that are anti-Israeli advocates, they never take a second to look around and see what is going on to the LGBTQ community in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. You just mentioned an article that was published 2 days ago about life as a gay man in the Gaza Strip, and people need to flee their life because if they're caught, they will be executed or be forced to do something that will terminate them eventually, or be put in prison because of it. And eventually, what these people and the LGBTQ communities that only attacks Israel on a one-sided decision, they always fail to mention what is going on in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. They fail to mention that a few years ago, the Palestinian Authority has issued arrest warrants against Al-Qaus organization members. Al-Qaus is a Palestinian organization that basically is written under the Israeli law, so it's an Israeli-Palestinian organization that works in Bethlehem and in the West Bank. And because a lot of people were against their activity promoting LGBTQ agenda, the Palestinian Authority issued arrest warrants against them. And they asked people if they see anyone in this kind of activity, they wanted them to tell the authorities so they can go and arrest them. And that's something that suddenly the pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli organizations kind of kept silent about it. They didn't mention it. They didn't talk about it. They didn't publish brochures about it. They didn't say that the Palestinian Authority is persecuting the LGBTQ community. They just kept quiet. They don't care about it. And one of the other issues is that suddenly Israel is being blamed because the lack of advantage in LGBTQ community in the Palestinian Authority, as if Israel controls every aspect of life in the Palestinian Authority. And that's something that, in my opinion, is super crucial to talk about and to mention. I don't want to act in whatabouism, but it's important to show that eventually, yes, Israel is being advanced in LGBTQ communities. We have today about 66 cases of Palestinian refugees from the West Bank that found shelter in Israel and now are being able to work in Israel as a refugee visa because of their sexuality and because they were persecuted in the West Bank. And this is something that we need to talk about no matter what. We don't have to hide it. We don't need to hide it because someone might say that we are acting in pinkwashing or not. We're gonna keep celebrating the gay month and the biggest gay parades in the Middle East, and it's gonna be successful, and it's gonna be happy for all of us, because eventually this is what Israel is. It's this place that, yes, we do have a lot of issues that we need to fix, but on the other hand, it's still the beacon of light in the Middle East and the most advanced place that you can find in the Middle East.
I want to tell you, Jonathan, you suffer more than I do as a victim. Why do I say that? Because I get a double victimhood by the Palestinians and their anti-Semitic supporters because A, I'm an Israeli, and two, I'm Jewish. But you get it in the next three ways because A, you're an Israeli, secondly, you're Christian, and third, you're also gay. If I take on the Christian aspect, for instance, I can move away from Gaza into Bethlehem. When Israel gave Bethlehem to Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian authorities, a so-called peace gesture, the Christians were the majority in a prosperous middle-class town. But since Israel withdrew and the Palestinian Authority took over and Arafat's henchmen came in, they've driven the Christians out of Bethlehem. They are now a minority. I don't know what it would be like for an Israeli Christian gay guy in Lebanon, in even Bethlehem these days, or even if you weren't Israeli, say you were a Palestinian Christian gay guy, you would be a minority even in the once Christian town of Bethlehem.
Yeah, that's correct. A few weeks ago, there was an event that was about to happen in the West Bank by a gay Arab Palestinian singer. And there was a protest against it, and a lot of eventually the protesters against that event went on and ruined the cars that were standing outside of that event. And they made that event shut down because it's gay and because it's promoting the LGBTQ community. And they were filmed on video saying that this thing shouldn't happen in the West Bank because of our culture and because of our religion. And I'm always, this is why I'm always saying that the anti-Israeli and the pro-Palestinian, a lot of them are hypocrites, because when things like that happen, when anti-human rights violations done by the Palestinian Authority or by a Palestinian mob, no one says anything about it. They just keep it quiet. They keep it among themselves. They kind of, in a way, want to bury their heads in the sand, just not to look at reality in the face. And this is something that we're trying to do, is to actually promote that, because I do care about human rights, and I do care about the LGBTQ community's rights and women's rights and minorities' rights in the West Bank. And if someone wants to blame me that I'm doing that because I'm an Israeli advocate, then they can do whatever they want with it. They can say it till tomorrow. It will not make it true, because eventually these things needs to be above the surface and we need to talk about it.
It's an interesting subject because we're recording this interview just a few days before President Biden comes to Israel, and he is actually going to drive to or go to Bethlehem in order to meet Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. And I doubt very much, although they talk about human rights in America an awful lot, I doubt that the Catholic President of the United States will say anything at all to Mahmoud Abbas about the persecution of gays in Palestinian society, or even the persecution of the Christian community within the town of Bethlehem since Israel handed it over to the Palestinians. But talk to me more, actually, about the Israeli Arab LGBT community, because you told me that only, I think it was 17% of the Arab Israelis are out of the closet. They're hiding there out of fear. Tell me more about this issue.
Yeah, well, there was a survey that was published throughout the Pride Month last June. And eventually, this is the first ever survey that is done widely in the Arab community in Israel. Because we don't really have a lot of activity among the LGBTQ Arab community in Israel. And this is something that comes because of the traditions and because of the communities and because they're still living in villages and not really in mixed cities or bigger cities. So there's still more struggle in that. So that survey that was published in Ynet during Pride Month was done by the Aguda. This is the LGBTQ organization in Israel. And it stated that only 17% of the Arab LGBTQ community in Israel are outside of the closet. And about 40% of them will continue to be, not from the 17, but 40% of those who answered the survey said that they don't see themselves ever coming out of the closet because they're afraid of persecution, and they're afraid because eventually they're living a lifestyle that is more strict, that is more religious, that is more in a way, culturally more of an Arab aspect. And they're afraid that something would happen to them if they come outside of the closet. And this is, in my opinion, a really devastating statistics to have, because if we want to look and compare the Jewish and the Arab community in Israel, you can say that the Jewish community has been advancing in LGBTQ culture and LGBTQ life and organizations since the 70s here in Israel. During the 80s, during the 90s, it was even, during the 90s, we already had IDF official soldiers and officers that were outside of the closet. Notice that even before the United States only had that in 2009. And this is something that eventually in Israel was super advanced. but the Arab community has kind of stuck in the back. And only in the last 2 years we are seeing and we are doing as well activity in the Arab community. Last month, during the month of Pride, we had there's an organization that is called Bayt al-Mim, the House of Meme, and meme in Arabic, the letter M is al-Mithliyin. It's the LGBTQ community, basically. It says in Arabic, it's like me and you. It's like similar, the same. That's what Mithliyin means. And they had a huge kind of, you can say, billboards put along in a few Arab villages in northern of Israel to say, hey, we're here. You're not gonna, keep us hiding. We're gonna keep on fighting. We're gonna, in a way, um, be outside of the closet in one of these days. And immediately they took them down. Immediately, the people who put those billboards on were in threats. Many of them didn't participate in the Haifa parade because of that, because they were afraid that something would happen to them. But eventually, this is kind of a way that now the Arab Israeli community, the LGBT Arab Israeli community, is starting to develop, and it's starting to eventually make a revolution towards having it kind of in a normal way, like in the Jewish community here in Israel.
Well, there's a huge amount of gun violence within Arab society here, mainly by the younger Arabs in Arab towns and villages, and the inter-Arab fighting and death through gun battles is tremendous. Israel seems to be trying to get on top of that with police action, etc. But so far as supporting the Israeli Arab LGBT community, it seems to me that the Israeli Knesset can do a lot more, because Israeli society is these days quite open about it. In fact, there are gay members of the Knesset. But I think this is an issue that even the Arab members of the Knesset could take more action in opening the way. Do you think they haven't done it because it's seen as a cultural thing that even the Arab members of the Israeli Knesset don't want to handle?
Yeah, it has been a thing throughout the years. I've written a few op-eds about it in the last few years about Mansour Abbas and even Ayman Odeh. Mansour Abbas is the head of a religious party that is called Ra'am. They are a religious party, and he said again and again that he will never promote or accept any pro-LGBTQ law to pass. He will not vote for it. And we have Ayman Odeh, the head of the Arab Joint List, that is always, that's why it's a joint list, because there's another list there of Ahmed Tibi that said the same thing. Ahmed Tibi said that he will never promote any pro-LGBTQ law or any pro-LGBTQ issue that needs to be solved. And we have Ayman Odeh that only one time voted in favor of an LGBT law that basically claimed that law that it should be forbidden for a converting treatment to be done to people under the age of 18. And there was a huge chaos in the Arab community after Ayman Odeh voted for that law to prevent people under the age of 18 to go through a conversion treatment that never helps, by the way. It should be illegal to have a conversion therapy. And so we're kind of stuck in this position where the Arab members of Knesset are afraid to actually touch or talk about or deal with the issue of an LGBTQ status quo or the LGBTQ advantage in the Arab community. So we have only one member of Knesset as of today. Her name is Ibtisam Marane. She's from the Labour Party, and she was the only Arab member of parliament that actually spoke out loud on the Knesset platform in favor of the LGBTQ community, and she's focusing on the Arab LGBTQ community. So she's working today on actually opening a shelter for an LGBTQ Arab members here in Haifa, because today the only shelters that we have are in Tel Aviv, and because Haifa is considered to be kind of the capital of the Arab, of north of Israel and the Arab LGBTQ community, they wanted it to be in the periphery, to be more closer to the people who actually will need it, and they wouldn't have to drive towards Tel Aviv in order to be able to sleep a good night's sleep and not stay in gardens and outside of their homes. So she's the only one who actually is speaking about it. I'm really happy that it finally happened, but it's not enough. We need to have more Arab members of Knesset to do so. And the only way, in my opinion, to see that happening is that to have Arab representatives in almost every political party that we have in the Knesset, because the Arab parties are not gonna deal with that subject anytime soon.
I want to move on, Jonathan. I want you to tell our viewers the story you told me that I found deeply disturbing about an event that was sponsored by the Israeli Ministry of Culture and Sport, in which a female singer sang a Hezbollah anti-Israel war song. Tell us about this event. Was it reported to the ministry? Was there an investigation? Tell me the background to this.
Okay, so there was an event that was done at the 7th of July. It was actually last week in the city of Arabe. It's a city north of Israel, really close to the Lake of Galilee. And there was a huge event that happened throughout a few days. And in one of these days, there was a concert dedicated to a Lebanese well-known singer that she's basically a singer that is really connected to Hezbollah. She sings a lot of songs for Hassan Nasrallah. She does a lot of concerts in favor of wars. She has a lot of songs that are militant songs that are promoting war against Israel, that are promoting the destruction of Israel. And this event that was funded and financed and had even the logo of the Ministry of Culture and Sports, they had an evening that is dedicated to that singer, to Julia Boutros. And one of the songs that they sung there is the song Revolution, Muqawim, I'm a rebellion, that's the name of the song. And it was a song that was sung against the 2006 war, in favor of the 2006 war, basically saying that Lebanon should continue an attack. And we all know that it wasn't Lebanon that fought against Israel, but whether it was Hezbollah that fought against Israel. And in my opinion, it's an outrageous. We're now working, a few activists, on actually writing a letter to send it to the Ministry of Culture and Sports, because we don't believe that any of them has actually noticed what they sponsored and what they collaborated with.
I think this is worthy of a deeper investigation, and I think the Israeli Ministry of Culture and Sport ought to be a bit more cautious about which events they sponsor, because it could kick back in our faces. On a more positive note, when you meet parliamentary advisors and social activists, as you did in Quebec, Canada, for instance, or when they come over here, do they come with perceived notions of Israel, which they get from their media and their local campus atmosphere and whatever? And give me examples of what you find most surprising to them when they meet with you and meet advocates like you, Israeli advocates like you, that are not the common majority in Israel, let's say. How have you noticed a change in attitude, if not policy, when it comes to Israel, when you either go into places like Quebec or other places to do your advocacy work?
Yeah, well, one of the major things that I've always noticed is that people are in shock when they listen or hear from an Israeli minority speaking in favor of Israel. Because first of all, a lot of them come here with a prejudice that Israel is a religious state. Yes, it's a Jewish state, but it doesn't mean that the whole aspect of lives are religious here. So they're always amazed with this mixture of multicultural and multi-religious and multi kind of even in neighborhoods in Haifa, for example, we have mixture of religious and non-religious living in the same neighborhood. Not only non-religious, but even non-Jewish living in the same neighborhood. So it's kind of in a way they're always surprised to see that. They always think that everyone is living in their own separate places. Everyone is with their own community and not really having this mixture of things. So when people come here and suddenly they see that, they go to a bar, they go to a restaurant, and they hear Arabic and they hear English and they hear Hebrew all around them, and suddenly it's kind of like, okay, maybe I didn't really get it right because a lot of people told me things differently. And especially when I meet a lot of people like that, they're always surprised to hear about minorities that are actually advocating for Israel, minorities that are actually are happy to be Israelis, are eventually speaking about their life experience positively, although they didn't have a really easy life, but they do speak about it positively. And not only that, when I created the Minorities Project, that was basically the first of its kind ever project that brought minorities abroad in a wider perspective. Not only a person by itself, because I could have done it alone. I received a lot of requests for speaking engagements tours throughout the States and Europe to do it myself, to just come and speak to the audience. But I didn't want to do that. And the reason for that is because I wanted to show the different sides that we have in Israel. Not different sides, whether it's pro or anti Israeli. No, it's the different cultures and the different opinions that we have and the different debates that we have. Because eventually, this is the wider image of Israel. This is who we are. This is how we act on a daily basis. I have a Muslim or a Bedouin friend that sometimes we don't agree on the same things, but we agree on that we're Israelis and that we're happy to be here. So I wanted to show them this kind of image that kind of reflect on Israel's surface, and to kind of take them into a small kind of deep dialogue of what is going on even among ourselves in our debates in our communities. And I wanted them to be active as well, activists in their own communities. That was something that was a deal breaker for me, because I didn't want just people to go there and say, yeah, Israel is great, Israel is wonderful, everything is fantastic, everything is pink, everything, we're so happy. Yes, we are happy, but the situation is not like that. We do have a lot of issues to fix um, for the Bedouin communities, for the Christian communities, for the Druze communities as well. Even for myself, from the South Lebanon Army community, we have a lot of issues that we still didn't solve with the government, with the Israeli government. So it was really important to me that those people who come on these delegations would be people that are activists in their own community. And we always love to say that in Israel, we're going to fight for our communities, but abroad, we're going to fight for our country, because this is what resembles our lives. It's yes, it's contradictions sometimes, but it's necessary to have it because it makes us kind of understand more. Life isn't perfect and life isn't easy. And what we want to do is to try and make everything work on together. So once people see that, if we go abroad and they see that when we talk to them, or when they come here and they see that in their own eyes happening in cities and villages, it kind of takes the rug under their feet, especially anti-Israeli activists that I've met. And suddenly they have nothing to say. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to act. They didn't know how to react to what was going on. It's kind of in a way that they were hit with reality in the face and they haven't recovered from it anymore. A lot of people talked to me later on, contacted me throughout social media to continue and ask me questions that they were afraid to ask in public because their friends were sitting next to them and they didn't want them to see if whether they're rethinking a lot of things that they were told in the past. And this is, in my opinion, a huge success because eventually I'm not there to shift their mind 100% from anti-Israeli to pro-Israeli. I'm there to make them rethink what they thought and to rethink the things that they were told and to question, because eventually I'm here to give the information, but it's your job to go and question everything I told you. It's your job to go and research for it. It's your job as well to go and find out more ways to see what is going on. And in my opinion, this is something that is really important to present and to have.
I really think, Jonathan, that we need to put a elite group together of people like yourself. Incidentally, your story is pretty unique because had your parents not escaped from Lebanon and had they stayed there and had they not been slaughtered by Hezbollah, and they remained there, you could have been in Lebanon today, which is in a very pretty sad state because of the internal mismanagement and politics within Lebanon. So your story is unique. But if we were to take people like you, or even some of the Maronites, the Arabs, the Bedouin, the Druze, the Muslim and Christian Israelis, and send them even to places like America, into the Jewish heartland of America, which, in my opinion, is the Jewish community centers. In my opinion, we have been losing because of the drift of American Jewry into what I call the far left liberal woke fantasies. I think your visit to them would be a wake-up call. And I think that you could do more even than me in these sort of locations in order to make them pause and find their way back to their natural moral roots. And I also think, Jonathan, that now that groups are returning to Israel following the pandemic, that we ought to get together and invite groups to come up to Haifa to sit with us in places like, for instance, the Stella Maris, with its wonderful views of Haifa and its amazing views, and have an hour or so coffee break on their tour around Israel to meet people like you and hear people like you. And I think we should extend this to non-Jewish advocates abroad, Christian advocates, Jewish advocates, or whatever, even politicians, parliamentarians, to come up and meet us in a place like that in order to be inspired and hear your story. So first of all, I want to thank you for who you are and what you're doing. I think your story is pretty unique and it needs to be aired. Jonathan, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you very much, Barry, for having me. And I think it's your last remarks were super important because eventually it's easy to have a Jewish guy or a Jewish girl speak about Israel. It's like a typical story that we hear. But once it comes from a minority, it puts it in a whole different perspective and a whole different view that is super important. And this is why, in my opinion, it's even double the importance from a regular Jewish pro-Israeli advocate. And that's why you need to make sure that on every delegation and every organization, there need to be Israeli minorities that speaks out and are there to help people. To understand more about the complexity that we have here in Israel.
So viewers, if you're thinking of bringing a group to Israel, then you would like to meet people like Jonathan and many others, friends of mine, who are non-Jewish friends, Israeli friends of mine, and you might find their stories inspiring and useful, contact me, contact Jonathan, and we'll set it up for you. This is Barry Shaw. Thank you for joining me on The View from Israel.
אנו מכריזים בזאת